March 15, 2007. It's Wednesday afternoon in East Hartford, Connecticut, a middle-class community settled just off the Connecticut River.
East Hartford is a town of about 50,000 people.
It's a combination of residential neighborhoods, middle-class folks, but you have some commercial areas and also really industrial areas.
It's a place to raise a family, just a residential town. It's not known for much hustle and bustle. It's just a very nice area.
For 29-year-old Monique Cooper, it seems like an ordinary day. But an unexpected phone call will prove otherwise.
I was at home and my mom called me and she told me that Shemaya didn't come home.
Shemaya Smith is Monique's 22-year-old sister who lives at their mother's house.
According to Monique's mother, Shemaya never returned home after leaving for work the previous afternoon.
She left for work around 3 p.m. on the 14th, and her mother hadn't seen or heard from her since.
I'm like, that's not like her. And she was like, have you heard from her? I'm like, no, I'm gonna try to call her. So I hung up with my mom and I tried to call Shemaya, but her phone just kept going straight to voicemail.
Hi, it's Shemaya. I can't come to the phone right now. Please leave a message.
Come on, Shemaya.
I don't understand why her phone going straight to voicemail. So I kept calling, we leaving messages.
Shemaya, give me a call as soon as you get this.
At this point, the family was growing increasingly concerned.
I end up calling my mom back and I'm like, listen, I'm gonna call the police. Something's wrong.
Hi, I need to report my sister missing.
22-year-old Shemaya Smith had a radiant beauty that shined both inside and out.
She was nice, she was fun, she was very pretty. She was tall and pretty.
Shemaya had a lot of friends. She was silly. She was the life of the party. Her smile just lit up the room when she came in.
And Shemaya's love for makeup and fashion was just another way her personality shone through.
Anytime you seen Shemaya, she had that white eyeliner on them eyes, and that was her signature.
Shemaya was really interested in pursuing her cosmetology license.
I would bring my kids over there just to spend some time with Shemaya. And my daughter got on makeup or she got her nails done.
We'll just put on her stuff, like her heels and everything. Like, it used to be so much fun.
She had hoped to open up her own hair and nail salon at some point. She was looking to go to school so she could study cosmetology and achieve her dreams.
To save up the funds she needed for cosmetology school, Shemaya started dancing at a local nightclub named Cahoots.
So she was trying to work and get money so that she can pay and go to school.
A lot of women turn to exotic dancing as a way to make some fast cash. You can walk away with hundreds, maybe even thousands after one night of work.
So there was a means to the end. You know, it wasn't just, I'm gonna do this for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a temporary thing.
Around that same time, Shemaya fell in love with someone new, 24-year-old Dwayne Butler.
I believe they maybe met through a mutual friend. She took him very serious. He started staying with her at my mom's house.
Looking good.
Thank you.
Looking real good up there.
I'm so glad you were here.
How much you make? Okay, you did your thing.
He accepted her for who she was. He didn't try to make her be someone that she wasn't.
Look a little tired. You ready to go home?
Yeah, I'm exhausted.
All right, let's go.
He was very supportive, and he seemed like the type of guy who would help her reach her dreams.
But now, Shemaya has suddenly disappeared.
She left for work on the afternoon of March 14th, and 24 hours later, her family still can't get a hold of her.
I ended up calling the police and meeting the officers at my mom's house in East Hartford. When they got to the house, they was like, well, how long have she been missing?
It's been about 24 hours, but she left yesterday around 3 p.m. to go to work.
Okay, where does she work at?
She's a dancer at a local club.
Shemaya's mom says she didn't have a car, so Shemaya was actually relying on other people to help her get back and forth to work.
Some people she knows, some people maybe she doesn't know.
Do you have any idea who would have given her a ride? Maybe a boyfriend, co-worker?
Well, her boyfriend actually lives here with us, and we already asked him if he drove her to work yesterday, and he told us no.
Her family gave the police the name of her boyfriend, Dwayne Butler.
Well, can we speak with him?
Sure, he's upstairs.
The officers entered the home in an attempt to make contact with Dwayne Butler.
East Hartford PD.
But to their surprise, Dwayne wants nothing to do with them.
Dwayne, can we come in?
Now's not a good time.
He did not want to speak to them. He just wanted no parts of the East Hartford Police Department and the investigation that was going on with Shemaya.
On March 15th, 2007, police in East Hartford, Connecticut are attempting to speak with Dwayne Butler regarding the disappearance of his girlfriend, Shemaya Smith.
Dwayne, can we come in?
Now's not a good time.
He refused to come out of his bedroom, said he did not want to speak to them, and he just wanted no parts of the East Hartford Police Department and the investigation that was going on with Shemaya.
We don't know if it's because of how he thought about the police like some people do. Maybe he was scared that they might bring up something about his past. But it seems sketchy to the police that your girlfriend would be missing and you don't want to talk to us.
Doesn't seem like he's interested in speaking with us.
We found that kind of weird at the time. But, I mean, we liked him. We didn't have an issue with him.
He's just a little wary of the police, but he already told us the last time he seen her was yesterday before she went to work, so he probably won't be much help.
Since Shemaya is an adult and there's no sign of foul play, officers have their hands tied.
Well, unfortunately, it's only been 24 hours, so there really isn't much we can do right now.
What?
Are you serious?
It was like, oh, well, because she's an adult, we have to wait 48 hours.
They need 48 hours to have passed before they can officially file a missing persons report.
I'm like, 48 hours is too long. Anything could happen.
So Monique decides to take matters into her own hands.
I remember it like it was yesterday. And I got in my car, me and my 3 children, and we were driving to the news because I'm like, somebody got to say something. I need her face to get out there because somebody's seen her somewhere. I almost got into 3 car accidents trying to get to the news.
But once at the local news station, Monique doesn't get the help she is hoping for.
By the time I got to the news, they told me they couldn't put her picture out there because they needed to have police interactions or they had to get the information from the police department.
To know in your heart something is wrong with your loved one, but no one is there to help you, it must have been heartbreaking.
To be honest with you, in my opinion, they just didn't want to do it because she was black and nobody really cared.
Even though the number of black women that go missing in America is disproportionately high, their cases are less likely to be solved than those of white women. They don't get the media attention that we would like to allot to any missing person. They're underreported and as a result, undersolved.
The family has to wait another grueling 24 hours without any word from Shemaya before they can officially file a missing persons report.
It was a long waiting period. I slept on it that night. She was in my dream and she was telling me she was being held against her will. And I'm like, where are you? Where are you? And she's like, I don't know. And in my dream, she was telling me she had to have sex with these different guys. So I immediately thinking that, she's being trafficked or something.
The next day, when Monique and her mother are finally able to file the missing persons report, Monique informs police about the chilling dream she had the night before.
I did give them that information because I felt like that was a sign or something. I don't know.
And Shemaya's loved ones are becoming more and more suspicious of her boyfriend, Dwayne.
Yeah, he has been acting strange ever since you came by the house.
Once we realized that Shemaiah went missing, it's like he went missing. He came and got his stuff from my mother's house, and he moved out.
No one knows where he goes, so that was definitely a red flag number 2.
That's when the Detective Bureau picked it up and began to look into it.
Fortunately, police are able to track Dwayne down at a friend's home where he's now living.
He's brought in for questioning, and now he realizes he has to cooperate.
So when was the last time you saw Shemaiah?
It was 14th. I told her bye before she went to work.
He was the one that had seen her last before she left out that day. But he claims he didn't know who she left with.
Did you see what car she left in?
Nah, I couldn't see anything when she went out the door.
The police detectives had questioned, like, how do you not even look out the window or check on your girlfriend if someone's coming to get her?
I mean, look, we were close, right? But we weren't trying to, like, control each other or anything. I mean, she had her life, I had mine.
So did you go anywhere the evening of the 14th after Shemaiah left?
Nope. I was home all day and night.
They're able to substantiate that Dwayne really was home during the time period when Shemaiah disappeared.
And you have no idea where she could be right now?
No clue. But I am starting to get a little worried.
Based on the information that was shared by Dwayne, there wasn't anything that was substantial enough to keep him in custody, so Dwayne was eventually let go by East Hartford PD.
At this point, Shemaiah is still just missing, and everyone is hoping she's going to turn up.
After wrapping up their conversation with Dwayne, investigators head to the nightclub where Shemaiah works to speak with her manager.
They asked him, did Shemaiah report to work on the 14th? And he said no.
No, she never showed up. Never called either.
Do you know if she had problems with anyone? Fellow dancers, club patrons?
No, Shemaiah was pretty popular. I mean, all the other dancers loved her, and the customers loved her too.
He was like, well, this one guy, he's usually always there when she's there.
It was determined he had a history of also giving her a ride to and from work.
And what was his name?
Marcus, but it goes by the name Tank.
For detectives, this is just the lead they've been searching for.
If Tank gave Shemaiah a ride to work that day, but she never showed up for work, that might mean that Tank knows where she is now. Thanks to the manager at the nightclub where she works, detectives have just received a promising new lead in the disappearance of 22-year-old Shemaiah Smith.
Shemaiah's manager tells detectives about a regular she had who went by the nickname of Tank.
It was determined he had a history of also giving her a ride to and from work.
Is Tank the person who gave Shemaiah a ride to work on the afternoon of the 14th?
Shemaiah never showed up for work that afternoon, so if Tank was the person who picked her up from home, he likely knows where she is now.
Investigators are eager to speak with their new suspect.
Thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
When they reach out to Tank, he agrees to come in for an interview.
So here's the deal. We know your friend Shemaiah Smith is missing.
Shemaiah from the club?
Tank seems very concerned.
He admits that he's one of Shemaiah's regulars at the club, but he says he has no idea where she is now.
Tell us about the last time you saw her.
I think when I gave her a ride to work.
On the 14th?
I think so.
That's when detectives turn up the heat.
Listen, Tank, we know Shemaiah never showed up for work that day.
That makes you the last person to see her before she went missing.
No. What? No, I swear. I just dropped her off.
Detectives believe they've just caught Tank in a flat-out lie.
But Tank insists he had nothing to do with Shemaiah's disappearance.
It may not have been the 14th. I think it was the 13th I gave her a ride.
He says maybe he got his days wrong, and he actually dropped her off for a shift on the 13th.
I'm sorry. These days run together sometimes.
When detectives look deeper into Tank's whereabouts on the afternoon of the 14th, they discover he's telling the truth.
He had an alibi on the 14th. He was at work the whole day into the evening.
So now detectives are back at square one.
Another night passes without any sign of Shemaiah Smith.
Everyone is becoming more and more concerned. Time is of the essence here.
At that point, they didn't know what was going on. But her sister wasn't going to let this go.
The next morning, Shemaiah's sister Monique begins her own investigation.
Come on.
I locked myself in a room for some hours and just was playing with numbers to try to get into her voicemail. Back then, you was able to access your voicemail from anywhere.
She just kept putting in so many numbers.
And after hours of trying every combination she can think of, Monique finally makes headway.
Yes.
Finally, I was able to get into her voicemail, and I saw the last person on there.
She finally cracks the code and finds a voicemail from March 14th at 11:55 a.m., just a few hours before Shemaiah disappeared.
Hey, honey.
There was a voicemail from a man, and the voice who she did not recognize was saying, "Hey, I'm back in town. Give me a call if you want to get together."
Anyway, you know where to reach me.
What the hell?
Who is this person? She was like, the voicemail sounds strange.
All she knows is that the man calls himself Kenny.
I felt relieved, like we were onto something. After I listened to the guy's voice message, I end up getting his phone number.
And after logging the number, Monique immediately calls police with news of what she's uncovered.
Monique was truly invaluable to this case. She was going to do whatever it takes to find her missing sister.
How she did it, I couldn't tell you, but I recall the sister had somehow got access to Shemaiah's phone.
Some guy called her that morning. Some guy named Kenny.
I kept asking the police, like, who is this guy? We don't know if he got my mother's house keys. We don't know if he's riding by watching us. We don't know if we're safe.
All right, we'll look into this immediately. Thank you so much, Monique.
After receiving Kenny's phone number from Monique, detectives run it through their system and immediately get a hit.
It came back to Kenneth Otto Sr., who's a 56-year-old white male.
He had a really good job as a sales manager, and he was making 6 figures for this company, and this is back in 2007. He did very well. He had a family, he had a wife, lived in this house in Ellington.
He was a man of means, and we began looking into him.
But to their surprise, investigators uncover very little.
This guy is squeaky clean.
He's in his late 50s. He's married with 2 kids, financially well off. And here he is leaving a voicemail for this 22-year-old young woman. What overlap could these two possibly have?
Connecticut detectives investigating the disappearance of 22-year-old Shemaiah Smith have just gotten another promising lead thanks to her sister, Monique Cooper.
Monique was smart enough to essentially hack into Shemaiah's voicemail and found a message from a man named Kenny from the morning before Shemaiah disappeared.
Hey, honey.
What the hell?
He's in his late 50s. He's married with 2 kids, financially well off. And here he is leaving a voicemail for this 22-year-old young woman who's starting to find her way in the world. What overlap could these two possibly have?
Detectives are wondering if maybe Kenny is another one of Shemaiah's regulars from the club where she danced.
Investigators waste no time bringing Kenneth Otto in for questioning.
Shemaiah spans off the face of the earth. There's done a fair amount of work trying to find her somewhere else after being with you, so we're hoping that you might have some more insight with where she might be. Right. I don't know where she is. I haven't seen her for a couple days.
He admitted that he knew Shemaiah and that he frequented cahoots he went there regularly and visited with Shemaiah.
Roughly, when do you think is the first time you ever laid eyes on her? The end of January, beginning of February.
Ken described his relationship with Shemaiah as if he was almost looking out for her, almost trying to help her accomplish her goals.
She's a really good kid. I mean, you know, when you sat and talked to her, really talk, a nice kid. I mean, she's not happy. She's talking about being independent. She wants to be independent. She wants to be on her own. She doesn't want to have to dance. She wants to go to cosmetology school, get her life together, that type of thing.
It was pretty clear to us that he seemed interested in her, and he mentioned that he gave her money and that he was helping this young lady.
Well, I gave her $500. I do that with some other people. If I believe somebody is real, I will give them some money. Male or female, yeah, I gave them money. I'm not a saint, but, you know, I don't have any problem. I mean, helping somebody if if I believe they're willing to go forward, and that's good. You know, a couple $100 here, $100 there.
He's trying to portray himself as just this magnanimous person.
But investigators are wondering if there's another, more nefarious reason for Ken's $500 payment to Shemaiah.
Detectives asked Ken point blank if he and Shemaiah had a sexual relationship.
That day, she asked you for money, but she didn't proposition. No, because, you know, I can't get a hold of her. I had suspicions of cancer, and, you know, it's fun to fight, but it doesn't, you know, I don't do it.
It was just such an off-the-wall comment. He kind of jumped right in.
How many times did you actually spend any time with her outside of her work? We never really spent all that much time together.
But Ken says that on the morning of March 14th, Shemaiah reached out to him asking for a ride to work.
He says he agreed to help her out.
Hey, honey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for picking me up.
Anytime, sweetheart.
I picked her up 3:30, 4 o'clock later, and I dropped her at Cahoots, right back on the highway, like, I don't know, 4:05.
Mr. Otto was specific about where he dropped her off because we asked him, Mr. Otto, did you drop her at the parking lot or at the front door? And he said, oh, right at the front door.
On the surface, Ken's story seems plausible enough, except for one thing.
Detectives already know Shemaiah never showed up for work that day. So if Ken's telling the truth, what happened after he dropped her off at the front door of the club?
In an attempt to verify Ken's story, detectives obtained surveillance footage from the nightclub.
There's no sign of Ken or Shemaiah in the footage from the 14th.
She never came in the front door, and there was no black pickup truck dropping her off at the front door. So we knew pretty much that Mr. Otto was being less than truthful.
Is it possible he got his days mixed up like Tank did? Sure, but based on the surveillance footage, Ken hadn't been at the club that whole week. So that would have been a much bigger mix-up than a one-day discrepancy.
Despite Ken's suspect behavior, police still have no proof Shemaiah was a victim of a crime.
Maybe Ken is just being cagey because he's trying to hide this from his wife and doesn't want her to know he's been spending time with a 22-year-old woman behind her back.
But in the following days, Ken's behavior becomes more and more erratic.
He contacts one of the detectives and sounds as if he's trying to bribe the police to drop the investigation.
Please leave a message.
Hey, Donald Olson, Ken Otto. Maybe we can work something out over the phone. I was really kind of set back. I was kind of hoping you'd call and tell me that we found our little missing friend. Anyway, you know, I gotta think about what I can do to help out get this off my plate. Because, I don't really want to be active in this. So, all right, I'll talk to you. Take care.
This guy is really starting to sweat.
Now more than ever, detectives are convinced they're on the right track.
They get a hold of Shemaiah and Ken's phone records.
The phone records show Shemaiah and Ken traveling together on the 14th, but they don't go to Cahoots nightclub.
Investigators can see that both phones traveled to a remote area in the neighboring town of Stafford, Connecticut.
Stafford is about 20 miles away from East Hartford.
But that's not Ken's only link to the area.
Turns out, Ken owns a massive piece of property in that same area of Stafford.
The property is kind of landlocked. It's in the middle of a bunch of trees, heavily wooded property.
I mean, it was 75 acres. That's a lot of ground.
That many acres of unoccupied property, it absolutely could be a place that would make me think that someone would either be held or buried.
It's a concerning thought. However, investigators will need more than suspicions to secure a search warrant for the property.
You have to understand, a search warrant is a very powerful piece of paper. It means that the police are in your house, under your bed, in your underwear drawer.
You have to have probable cause to believe a crime was committed. Police have to be able to articulate what crime they think was committed and the area or thing that they're asking to search.
They were going to have to get on it and get on it fast, and they were going to have to make some moves even if they didn't get the warrant yet.
So investigators come up with a plan. If they can't go by land, they'll go by air.
We used the Connecticut State Police to assist us in that. And they have at least one helicopter, and they were obliging.
And on March 23rd, they conduct a flyover of Ken Otto's property.
When they did the aerial search, they saw tire tracks going in and out. They saw a big camper.
But that's not all.
The pilot informed us, hey guys, look a little bit to the left. You see that big burn pile there? And that's when Don Olson and I looked at each other and said, oh my God. It was one of those holy cow moments.
On March 23, 2007, investigators in East Hartford, Connecticut have gotten one step closer to locating missing 22-year-old Shemaya Smith.
Police believe an older man named Kenneth Otto, who Shemaya recently became involved with, was the last person she was with before she disappeared.
He also owns a huge piece of remote land in a nearby town of Stafford.
And when investigators fly over the property by helicopter, they see something that makes their hearts drop.
The pilot informed us, hey guys, look a little bit to the left. You see that big burn pile there? And that's when Don Olson and I looked at each other and said, oh my God. It was one of those holy cow moments.
Without a moment to waste, investigators decide it's time to make a bold move.
There are exceptions to that warrant requirement, and one of which is if there's exigent circumstances.
It means you don't need a warrant because the feeling is that someone's life is in danger and there's no time to go get a warrant.
So based on the detective's suspicion that someone may be in imminent harm, they decided that they would move forward with searching the property.
And when investigators begin examining the burn pit, they make a gruesome discovery.
They found teeth, they found pieces of bone, and they found a piece of a foot, a human foot, in that fire pit.
Police also found 3 spent .40 caliber shell casings in the fire pit, along with what looked like some sort of house key.
Inside the nearby camper, there's more evidence that something terrible happened here.
You could see 2 chainsaws on the table.
They found a mop with blood on it. They also found a piece of carpet with blood on it. And they found a vacuum bag that also had blood on it.
The detectives described the property as almost like the devil's playground.
Now, investigators just need to prove the charred remains and blood evidence belong to Shemaya Smith.
So, police sent the remains to a lab in Connecticut to be analyzed.
Meanwhile, detectives head to the home of Shemaya's mother.
Since Shemaya lived there, they wanted to see if the key they found in the fire pit is a match for the home.
When investigators try the key in the front door, a solemn realization sets in.
They put it in the door and they turned the lock. It's like I felt it in my stomach, like a punch.
And soon after, the DNA results confirm everyone's worst fears.
The detectives reached out. I remember it like it was yesterday. He was like, well, we found something and we wanted to let you guys know that Shamaya is deceased. And I just was crying and crying. I was like, Mom, what happened? She was like, they found her. I was happy. Because I'm like, okay, is she alive? And my mom was like, come here. And she just hugged me and she said, no, she's gone. I just didn't understand why. Like, she was just so quiet and so sweet.
Armed with this new evidence, police are finally ready to take Kenneth Otto into custody. And by now, police have been tailing him for weeks.
In that time, his wife filed for divorce and Ken was spiraling.
We had a pretty good idea that Mr. Otto knew that his time was coming, and we were watching him. We had surveillance teams on him.
He called his lawyer and said that he felt like some guys was following him. So he thought it was Shamaya's family, but it was the actual detectives following him.
As investigators prepare to pull Ken over and make the arrest, he goes into panic mode.
He was driving extremely erratically, running red lights, taking quick turns.
He was trying to get away.
On May 15, 2007, murder suspect Kenneth Otto is evading East Hartford police after they confirm the human remains found on his property belonged to missing 22-year-old Shamaya Smith.
Like, it was evident at that point he knew the cat was out the bag, as they say. It was up for him.
He was driving extremely erratically, running red lights, taking quick turns.
He was trying to get away.
Police follow Ken all the way to Bradley International Airport.
It seems he's trying to flee out of state, but police are able to surround him in the parking lot.
Call the police!
Please, put your hands up!
Investigator Olson had the honor of slapping the handcuffs on him. He's the guy that gets to say, Mr. Otto, you are under arrest for murder.
You have the wrong guy. I didn't do anything.
Even after he's arrested, Ken still won't admit that he had anything to do with Shamaya Smith's murder.
Regardless, investigators search his vehicle for any other potential evidence.
He had about $10,000 in cash. He also had Canadian currency and his passport.
So investigators believe he wasn't just trying to flee out of state, he was trying to flee to Canada.
They also discovered he had erectile dysfunction medication, an escort service card, as well as a bag with women's jewelry.
That made them think, could Shamaya have not been the first victim? Maybe those were trophies.
I think that he has done it before. The way he did it to my sister, there's no way he couldn't have did this before. He just never was caught.
Police were never able to link Ken to any other murders, but the discovery of all that extra women's jewelry in his car when he was trying to flee was certainly unsettling.
Kenneth Otto is charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence.
We booked him, took all his property. He had a very high bond that he could not meet. I want to say at least $1 million, maybe more.
When Ken's trial begins in November of 2008, prosecutors lay out what they believe happened on the afternoon of March 14th.
Some of the most damning things that were brought up by the prosecution was that, by his own admission, he was the last one to see her.
Hey, honey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Ken never denied that he picked her up to take her to work at 3:30 that afternoon.
But prosecutors assert he never dropped Shamaya off at work like he claimed.
Instead, Ken took her to his 75-acre property in Stafford, Connecticut.
We really don't know exactly what happened inside that camper, but the blood evidence would lead us to believe that's where she was killed.
Since police found those .40 caliber shell casings in the fire pit, it's likely that Shemaiah was shot to death.
But that was never conclusively proven forensically.
And the murder weapon was never officially located.
But one thing is clear. Ken burned Shemaiah's remains in the fire pit on his property.
Everything that he tried to get rid of, the house key, the shell casings, and of course the human remains, was enough to prove that he killed Shemaiah.
But when it's their turn, Ken's defense team argues the evidence located on their client's property means nothing.
He had one of the most expensive defense lawyers in the area.
He has some pretty good lawyers. I didn't understand why would someone represent somebody like that, but hey, you have to make your money.
The defense brought up the fact that there were no witnesses to this crime.
They argue someone else could have killed Shemaiah and disposed of her on Ken's property to frame him.
And there's one other problem with the prosecution's case.
They never found out motive. Why did she die? Why did this happen? It's a mystery.
The defense argues that if the prosecution doesn't have a motive, and if they can't prove the circumstances under which Shemaiah died, how can they prove Ken killed her?
The prosecution is prepared to answer that question.
Prosecutors explain to the jury that they don't have to prove motive or exactly how Shemaiah died in order to prove Ken was her killer. Sometimes certain details in murder cases remain a mystery.
But in this case, everything points to Ken.
Even with his motives still a mystery, when all is said and done, Ken's fate is left in the hands of the jury.
On December 9th, 2008, the jury in Hartford found Kenneth Otto guilty of murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence.
He received 60 years. So that's basically life sentence all day long. He ain't coming out of there.
We all kind of screamed in the courtroom and was crying. It was just a sign of relief and justice.
When Monique reads her victim's impact statement, Ken remains stone cold.
He showed absolutely no emotions. He had a smirk on his face the whole time. He didn't speak, even when I was asking questions like why, what was her last words, what did she say? He said absolutely nothing. He just sat there with a smirk on his face.
For Monique and all of Shemaiah's loved ones, the question of why continues to linger.
It's still a lot of questions. Still to this day, I have questions that I wish could be answered.
I'm just still intrigued that they don't know anything about motive. You'd think that all this time he's in prison, he'd at some point say, let me just come clean and, he's in jail anyway. But no, he never did.
If my sister was here today, I'll just hold her close and wouldn't want her to, just wouldn't let her go.
I miss her. I wish she was here to see my kids. I wish she was here to see how much I've grown. I just wish that she was here to just witness so much.
In 1974, in the quiet California community of Visalia, something began moving through the darkness. At first, there was no name for him. There was only a growing collection of strange reports, disturbed homes, missing objects, and residents trying to understand how someone could enter their private spaces without being seen. The intruder did not behave like an ordinary thief. He appeared to study the houses before entering them. He watched routines, noticed habits, and seemed to understand when a family would be asleep and when the streets would be quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, he would come. A door that had been locked would be opened. A room that had been left untouched would suddenly feel violated. Small possessions could be disturbed or taken, leaving behind something more disturbing than the loss itself, the knowledge that a stranger had been inside the home while everyone slept. The police began to recognize a pattern. The same kind of intrusion appeared again and again. The offender seemed careful, patient, and strangely confident. He did not need to create chaos. He moved through houses with a purpose, leaving investigators with fragments rather than answers. They called him the Visalia Ransacker. Nobody knew this name belonged to a nightmare that would stretch across California for more than 4 decades. Nobody knew that the man moving silently through those neighborhoods would eventually be connected to rape, murder, and dozens of attacks. And nobody could have imagined that the answer would remain hidden until the age of genetic genealogy. But before there was a Golden State Killer, there was only a shadow. By the middle of the 1970s, that shadow had changed. Around 1976, a series of increasingly terrifying attacks began in Sacramento and surrounding communities. The offender no longer appeared interested only in stealing. He entered homes at night and confronted people where they should have been safest, in their bedrooms, behind locked doors, inside the familiar walls of their own houses. The attacks followed a pattern. He would enter while the victims were asleep. He could control the people inside the house, restraining one person while turning his attention toward another. Women were sexually assaulted. Men could be bound and forced into helplessness. Small objects might disappear afterward. Then the intruder would leave. For those people, there was no easy return to normal. A bedroom door was no longer simply a door. A window was no longer just glass. Darkness outside became a possibility rather than an absence of danger. The police gave the attacker another name, the East Area Rapist. The name spread quickly. And with every new case, the fear grew. Families checked their locks more than once before going to bed. Outdoor lights remained on. People looked at windows differently. A quiet street could feel exposed. The most unsettling part was that the attacker did not seem to act randomly. There were indications that he observed his victims before entering. The sense of preparation made the attacks more frightening, because it suggested that the victims were not simply unlucky. Their homes, their routines, their movements could have been watched before the attack ever began. Investigators were chasing someone who seemed to understand the value of patience. And yet, even as the cases accumulated, the investigators had something that would become enormously important many years later. They had biological evidence. They had DNA. But in that era, DNA could not tell them the name of the person who had left it behind. It could help establish that evidence from different crimes came from the same offender, but it could not simply point to a photograph, an address, and a full name. The evidence could say, this is the same person. It could not say, this is Joseph James DeAngelo. That distinction would define the investigation for decades. Then came 1979. Violence escalated again. The offender, who had terrorized homes through sexual assaults, was now connected to killings. In 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were murdered in Ventura County. Evidence recovered from that crime would later become one of the critical pieces in connecting the wider series of attacks. The investigators were beginning to see something horrifying. The crimes in Northern California and the killings farther south might not be separate stories. They might be chapters of the same story. A man who had attacked women in the north could also be the killer stalking victims in the south. The names changed because different jurisdictions were dealing with different crimes. One investigation had its own files, its own detectives, its own terminology. Another investigation had another set of reports. But the DNA was telling a different story. The evidence was pointing toward one offender. In Southern California, the killer became known as the original Night Stalker. Years later, the separate identities would finally merge into one terrifying name, the Golden State Killer. But in 1986, the story appeared to stop. The attacks attributed to the offender ended. There was no dramatic arrest. No confession. No courtroom revelation. There was only silence. And silence can be deceptive. For investigators, the case did not disappear. The files remained. The sketches remained. The statements of survivors remained. Most importantly, the biological evidence remained. The killer had vanished into ordinary life, but the evidence had not vanished with him. For more than 30 years, the case waited. California changed around it. Technology changed. Police departments changed. Investigators retired and new investigators took their places. The people who had once been children became adults. Survivors carried memories that were decades old. Somewhere among ordinary people, the unknown offender was growing older. But the DNA was still waiting. Then science changed the rules. In the 21st century, people began voluntarily submitting their genetic information to genealogy databases in order to discover relatives and reconstruct family histories. What had been created to help people understand where they came from offered investigators an entirely different possibility. What if the killer himself was not in a database? What if one of his relatives was? The idea was revolutionary. Investigators could take the unknown DNA profile from an old crime scene and search for distant genetic relatives. They would not necessarily find the killer directly. Instead, they could find branches of a family tree. From there, they could work backward. Age, location, family relationships, places where people had lived. The process was painstaking, more like assembling a vast puzzle than searching for a name. Eventually, one name began to emerge. Joseph James DeAngelo. He had lived in areas connected to the investigation. His age fit. His history raised questions. And there was another detail that made the possibility especially striking. DeAngelo had once been a police officer. For investigators, that meant they were looking at a man who had understood the world they were trying to navigate. He knew police procedures. He knew how investigators thought. He had knowledge of evidence and law enforcement that an ordinary suspect might never possess. For years, however, he had appeared to live an ordinary life. A neighbor could see an older man. A family member could see a father or grandfather. The investigators saw something else, a possibility that had to be proven. A genealogy connection was not enough. They needed DNA. They watched DeAngelo. They gathered biological material that could be compared with the evidence preserved from crimes committed decades earlier. Then came the answer investigators had waited for. The DNA matched. The shadow had a face. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in Citrus Heights, California. After more than 40 years, the man who had existed in police files under different names could finally be identified as one person. Visalia ransacker. East Area rapist. Original Night Stalker. Golden State Killer. 4 names. 1 offender. And one question that had haunted California for generations had finally been answered. Who was he? His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. But the arrest was not the end of the story. For the survivors and families, the years of fear could not be erased by handcuffs. A courtroom could establish responsibility, but it could not return the years stolen from them. It could not erase the nights spent checking locks, remembering footsteps, or wondering whether the person who had entered their home would ever be found. The case had survived because evidence survived. The investigators had waited. Science had advanced. And eventually, the smallest biological trace left behind decades earlier became stronger than time. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had depended on the silence of an unanswered question. On April 24, 2018, that silence was broken. The hunt was over. But for those who had lived through the nightmare, the real story was never about the legend of a killer. It was about the people whose lives he entered without permission, the families left behind by violence, and the evidence that refused to forget. Time had passed. California had changed. The killer had grown old. But the truth had been waiting all along. California in the 1970s was a place of contrasts. There were long stretches of warm afternoons, quiet residential streets, modest houses with open yards, children riding bicycles home before sunset, and families who believed they understood the rhythm of their neighborhoods. In communities around Sacramento and Visalia, ordinary life could feel almost predictable. People went to work in the morning, returned home in the evening, closed their doors, and expected the night to belong to them. The darkness outside was supposed to stay outside. But something was changing. At first, the changes were so small that they were easy to dismiss. A drawer that seemed slightly out of place. A missing possession. A window that someone thought they had closed. A strange feeling that something inside the house was not exactly as it had been the night before. Then the reports began accumulating. Someone had been inside. There was no dramatic explosion of violence. No obvious warning. The offender did not announce himself. He slipped into people's lives quietly, often while they were asleep, and left before they understood what had happened. That was what made the early Visalia cases so unsettling. The neighborhoods were not battlefields. They were places where people expected safety. The Visalia ransacker seemed to understand that expectation. He moved through residential areas and appeared to study the houses around him. He observed patterns. He seemed to know how people lived and when they were least likely to notice someone approaching. The intrusions suggested preparation rather than impulse. For investigators, this created a difficult problem. A conventional burglar might enter a house looking for valuables and leave as quickly as possible. But this offender appeared interested in more than property. He was learning the environment. He was learning the people. And each successful intrusion could teach him something. The geography of California made the problem even more difficult. The state was enormous, and communities were separated by significant distances. Different police departments handled different incidents. Information could move between jurisdictions, but not with the speed or connectivity available to modern investigators. There were no national DNA databases capable of instantly comparing an unknown biological sample against millions of profiles. There was no internet connecting detectives within seconds. There were no modern genealogy databases that could later allow investigators to construct an enormous family tree from a genetic clue. There were police reports, telephone calls, photographs, handwritten notes, physical evidence carefully collected and stored, and detectives who had to make sense of fragments. By the middle of the decade, the nature of the threat became increasingly serious. Sacramento and surrounding communities began experiencing a series of attacks that would eventually be connected to the same offender. The homes were different. The victims were different. The streets were different. But the fear was becoming familiar. Nighttime became the most dangerous period. Families who had once gone to bed without thinking twice about security began changing their routines. Doors were checked again and again. Windows became objects of concern. People became more attentive to unfamiliar cars parked nearby, and unfamiliar figures moving through neighborhoods. The most terrifying part was the uncertainty. People did not know what the offender looked like. They did not know where he lived. They did not know how he selected his victims. They did not know whether he had been watching them for days, or whether he had simply noticed their house while passing through the neighborhood. And because he was rarely seen clearly, imagination filled the gaps. A shadow outside could become a suspect. A noise in the yard could become an intruder. A creaking floorboard could turn an ordinary house into a place of terror. The police eventually gave the offender the name East Area Rapist. The name was functional, but it also revealed something important about the investigation. Authorities were dealing with a series of crimes that appeared connected, yet the person responsible remained unknown. Behind the name was a human being who was adapting. He was not simply appearing at random. The pattern suggested that he understood the vulnerabilities of residential homes. He entered during the hours when people were most defenseless. He used darkness and familiarity against his victims. The psychological effect spread far beyond the individual homes he entered. Fear does not remain neatly contained inside a police report. It travels. A victim tells a friend. A friend tells a neighbor. A neighbor tells a relative. Soon, an entire community begins changing its behavior. People start wondering whether the next house could be theirs. The streets remain physically the same, but they no longer feel the same. A porch light becomes a defensive measure. A locked door becomes a reassurance that may never feel sufficient. The simple act of going to sleep becomes a moment of vulnerability. And all the while, investigators continued collecting evidence. The offender left behind traces. Some of those traces would not become meaningful until years later. Among them was biological evidence that could eventually be used to establish that apparently separate crimes had been committed by the same person. At the time, however, the significance of DNA was limited by the technology available. The investigators could preserve it. They could compare it. They could determine whether samples came from the same offender. But they could not simply feed an unknown profile into a machine and receive a name. That limitation would haunt the investigation. The evidence existed, but the technology needed to interpret it did not. Then the attacks escalated. By the end of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the offender's crimes had moved beyond sexual assaults and home invasions. Murders became part of the pattern. The case was no longer only about a predator entering bedrooms after dark. Now families were being killed. The investigators began confronting the possibility that the man they had been searching for was capable of crossing an even more terrifying boundary. The crimes in Northern California and those farther south gradually began to reveal a larger pattern. The name Original Night Stalker emerged in Southern California. Different investigators had different terminology, different jurisdictions, and different files. But the evidence was slowly bringing them together. The same offender appeared to be moving through different parts of the state. The geography that once seemed to separate the crimes was beginning to connect them. And somewhere within that enormous landscape was a man living an apparently ordinary life. That fact is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. The offender did not exist outside society. He did not live in some isolated wilderness. He lived among ordinary people. He drove on ordinary roads. He passed ordinary houses. He could stand in a store, walk through a neighborhood, speak to another person, and appear completely unremarkable. The people around him had no way of knowing what was hidden behind the ordinary surface. For investigators, this created a terrifying possibility. They were not searching for a monster that looked like a monster. They were searching for a man who could disappear into normal life. Years later, when Joseph James DeAngelo was finally identified, that realization would become even more disturbing. He had once worked as a police officer. He understood the machinery of law enforcement from the inside. He understood procedures. He understood how investigators thought. He understood the importance of evidence. And yet, during the years when California was living under the shadow of the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker, there was nothing about his public identity that immediately revealed the secret. The investigation continued. Then, in 1986, the attacks attributed to the offender stopped. There was no triumphant ending. No suspect led away in handcuffs. No courtroom. No explanation. Only silence. For investigators, silence was not proof that the threat had disappeared forever. It was simply the absence of another known crime. The files remained open in one form or another. The evidence remained preserved. The memories remained inside the people who had survived. And California continued moving forward. New decades arrived. Technology advanced. Children grew into adults. Families changed. The neighborhoods changed. But somewhere in the evidence collected during those terrifying years was a biological signature belonging to the man investigators had spent years trying to identify. The killer had disappeared from the headlines. But he had not disappeared from the evidence. That distinction would become the foundation of the investigation's eventual breakthrough. For decades, the case seemed to represent the limits of human investigation. The police had clues, but no identity. They had patterns, but no name. They had DNA, but no person attached to it. The mystery survived, because the technology of the time could not yet turn the evidence into an answer. And so California waited. Not knowing that the answer was already buried inside the past. Not knowing that the man responsible had grown older. Not knowing that one day, decades after the first break-ins in Visalia, science would return to the evidence and ask a question that investigators in the 1970s could never have asked. Who does this DNA belong to? And when that question was finally answered, the quiet streets of California would be forced to remember everything they had tried to forget. Before there was a name for the man who terrorized California, there were people whose lives were changed by him. They were not case numbers. They were not photographs pinned to a detective's board. They were not simply entries in a database, dates on a timeline, or pieces of biological evidence stored inside envelopes. They were people who had gone to sleep expecting the next morning to look exactly like every other morning. They had homes. They had families. They had routines. They had ordinary worries that had nothing to do with crime. And then, without warning, the ordinary world inside their own homes became a place of danger. That is one of the most important things to understand about the Golden State Killer investigation. The story is often told through the name Joseph James DeAngelo, through the aliases East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker, through DNA and forensic genealogy, through the arrest that finally came in 2018. But for the people who experienced the attacks, none of those names existed at the beginning. There was only the moment when safety disappeared. In the communities where the attacks occurred, people lived close enough to one another that a frightening story could travel quickly. A neighbor might hear about a break-in. Someone might mention a woman who had been attacked. Another person might talk about strange behavior in the neighborhood. Then another incident would happen. And another. Slowly, a pattern began to form. But for each victim, the experience was intensely personal. The offender did not attack an abstract community. He entered individual houses. He crossed individual thresholds. He moved into private spaces where people had every reason to believe they were protected from strangers. That violation was part of the terror. A home normally carries a simple promise. When the door is locked, you are inside. The outside world is outside. The people you do not know cannot simply walk into your bedroom. For the victims of the East Area Rapist, that promise collapsed. The darkness of night became something different. A bedroom could no longer be understood simply as a bedroom. A hallway could become a place of uncertainty. A sound from another room could trigger immediate fear. The ordinary architecture of a home became inseparable from the possibility of intrusion. And the offender appeared to understand that psychological vulnerability. The information available in the case indicates that he did not simply act impulsively. He appeared to observe homes, study routines, and choose moments when people were least prepared to defend themselves. That meant the attacks could leave something behind even after the offender had gone. Fear. The fear of being watched. The fear of sleeping. The fear that someone might return. The fear that the person who had entered the house knew more about the victim's life than the victim knew about him. This is why the impact of the crimes cannot be measured only by what happened during the attacks themselves. The attack ended. The memory did not. For investigators, this created another challenge. Every victim carried a different memory of the offender. Some remembered fragments. Some remembered his behavior. Some remembered the circumstances surrounding the intrusion. Those memories had to be collected, recorded, compared, and preserved. The detectives were attempting to reconstruct the movements of a man who had deliberately tried to remain unknown. Each victim could provide another piece. A detail about the timing. A detail about the way the offender entered. A detail about what he touched. A detail about what he took. A detail about what happened before he disappeared. Individually, these fragments could seem small. Together, they began to reveal a pattern. The investigators gradually understood that they were not dealing with a series of unrelated incidents. The same offender appeared to be moving through different neighborhoods. The same sense of preparation appeared again. The same terrifying pattern returned. And the victims became the human record of that pattern. As the attacks continued, the psychological atmosphere changed around them. People who had never thought about criminal behavior began thinking about locks. Families became more cautious. People paid attention to unfamiliar movement outside their homes. Nighttime routines changed. The idea of being alone inside a house could suddenly feel dangerous. This was not merely fear created by headlines. It was fear created by the knowledge that someone had already demonstrated an ability to enter private homes. And the offender's ability to remain unidentified made the situation worse. There was no face that communities could point toward. There was no name that could be spoken with certainty. There was only a description of behavior. A man who appeared at night. A man who could move quietly. A man who seemed to prepare. A man who could disappear. The victims were therefore living inside a mystery, while also living inside its consequences. They knew what had happened to them. They did not know who had done it. That imbalance is difficult to understand from the distance of decades. Imagine knowing that someone had entered your home while you were asleep, knowing that he had watched your surroundings, knowing that he had left again, and then waking the next day without knowing whether he would ever return. Now imagine that the same uncertainty continued as the attacks spread to other neighborhoods. The fear would not remain attached to one night. It could follow a person into the next night. Then the next. Then the next. For some survivors, the end of the attack was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The investigation also carried another painful reality. The victims were being asked to remember. Again and again. They had to describe what happened. They had to speak to investigators. They had to help detectives understand the offender. Their memories became evidence. Their experiences became part of a criminal investigation that would eventually stretch across decades. And yet the investigation moved slowly because the technology of the time imposed limits. The police could collect evidence. They could preserve biological material. They could compare samples. But they could not transform an unknown DNA profile into a person's identity. That meant the victims could give investigators pieces of the puzzle without knowing whether the puzzle would ever be completed. The passage of time made this even more painful. Years passed. Then decades. Some victims continued their lives while carrying memories of what had happened. Some families changed. Children became adults. People moved. Communities changed. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited old files. But the original question remained. Who had done this? Among the victims connected to the later murder investigations were Lyman and Charlene Smith. Their deaths in Ventura County in 1980 marked a devastating escalation in the case. The offender, who had already terrorized communities through home invasions and sexual assaults, was now connected to murder. The significance of those killings would become even clearer years later, when biological evidence helped connect crimes that had once seemed separated by geography and investigative jurisdiction. The DNA did not erase the victims' stories. It connected them. That distinction matters. For the investigators, a DNA match could establish that the same offender was responsible for different crimes. But behind every match was a person whose life had been affected. A victim had once stood where the evidence was collected. A family had once lived where the police were now examining a crime scene. A person had once believed that the future would continue normally. Then the offender entered that future. The killings also changed the character of the investigation. Before, detectives were pursuing a predator who seemed to specialize in nighttime attacks. Now they were pursuing someone capable of killing. That possibility transformed the stakes. The offender was no longer simply a threat to privacy or personal safety. He was a potential murderer moving through California. And the people who survived him knew something the investigators could not fully know from paperwork. They knew what it felt like to be in the same space as him. They knew the terror of his presence. They knew how quickly an ordinary night could become something that would remain in their memories for decades. That human knowledge became part of the investigation. It helped detectives understand the offender's behavior. It helped establish connections between cases. It helped create a profile of a man who seemed to depend upon preparation, darkness, surprise, and psychological control. But even as investigators learned more, the victims still did not have the answer they wanted most. They did not know his name. For decades, that remained the central wound of the case. The offender had become almost mythological. East Area Rapist. Original Night Stalker. Eventually, Golden State Killer. Each name described a different chapter of the investigation. But none of those names belonged to a real person that investigators could place in handcuffs. The victims were therefore left with a strange kind of unfinished story. They knew the crime. They knew the damage. They knew the memories. But the person responsible remained beyond reach. That is why the later discovery of Joseph James DeAngelo would have such a profound meaning. It was not simply a police breakthrough. It was the moment when decades of unanswered questions finally began moving toward an identity. But before that happened, the victims had already carried the burden for years. The investigation could wait inside a filing cabinet. They could not. Their lives continued. They worked. They raised families. They grew older. They lived with memories that investigators could examine, but could never personally experience in exactly the same way. And when the case finally returned to public attention decades later, their experiences became central again. The old photographs. The old reports. The old evidence. The old descriptions. Everything that had once seemed frozen in time was suddenly moving. The case was alive again. The victims were no longer only memories inside an old investigation. They were the reason investigators kept looking. Because behind every piece of DNA was a person. Behind every crime scene was a life. Behind every line in an old police report was a night that someone had actually lived through. And behind the decades of silence was the simple truth that the passage of time had never made those experiences disappear. The offender had grown older. The world had changed. The technology had changed. But the victims had never been erased from the story. Their experiences were the foundation upon which the entire investigation rested. Without their memories, there would have been fewer patterns. Without the evidence recovered from their cases, there would have been no biological trail. Without the preservation of that evidence, there might never have been a path leading toward the future. The Golden State Killer investigation is often remembered as the story of how science finally caught a man who had escaped identification for more than 40 years. But the deeper story begins with the people who were there before science could help them. People who went to sleep in ordinary homes. People who expected morning to arrive peacefully. People who discovered that a locked door could not always guarantee safety. People who survived. People who lost loved ones. People who carried unanswered questions long after the police lights had disappeared from their streets. Their stories are not the background to this case. They are the center of it. And for decades, while the world moved on, their memories remained quietly connected to a single unanswered question. Who was the man who had done this? The answer was already somewhere in California. He was living a life that appeared ordinary. He was aging. He was disappearing into the crowd. And he had no idea that the evidence left behind in the lives he had tried to destroy would one day lead investigators directly back to him. The attacks did not begin with a scream. They began with silence. That was part of what made the man so terrifying. He did not need to announce his presence. He depended on the ordinary stillness of the night, on the belief that a locked house was a protected place, on the vulnerability of people who had closed their eyes believing that nothing was waiting for them in the darkness. In the communities where the East Area rapist operated, nighttime had once been familiar. People went to bed. Lights went out. Families separated into their bedrooms. The neighborhood became quiet. But somewhere beyond those closed doors, a predator was watching. His early crimes in Visalia had already demonstrated that he could enter homes without being detected. He appeared to study the houses and the people inside them. He learned routines. He seemed to understand which homes offered opportunities, and when those opportunities were greatest. Then, as his crimes expanded into Sacramento and surrounding communities, the intrusions became more personal and more violent. The offender entered while people were asleep. He did not behave like someone who had accidentally stumbled into a house. His actions suggested preparation. He knew what he wanted to do, and he appeared determined to control the people inside. For the victims, the experience could begin with something almost invisible. A sound. A movement. The realization that something in the room was wrong. Then the presence of a stranger. Imagine waking in the darkness and realizing that someone you have never seen before is standing inside your home. There is no time to understand how he got there. No time to ask who he is. No time to decide whether you should run. The person who entered already has the advantage. The offender used that advantage repeatedly. He could restrain members of a household while concentrating on another victim. He used fear as a method of control. He created situations in which the people inside the house understood that resistance could make the danger worse. The psychological cruelty of the attacks was not limited to physical violence. The offender wanted control. He wanted his victims to understand that he controlled the room, the movement, the decisions, and the moment. And then, after the attack, he disappeared. That pattern would become one of the most disturbing characteristics of the case. He could enter a house that appeared completely ordinary from the street and turn it into the center of a terrifying crime. Then he could walk away. Outside, the neighborhood might remain quiet. A porch light might still be glowing. A car might remain parked in the driveway. Another family might be sleeping only a short distance away, unaware of what had just happened. The contrast was enormous. Inside one house, lives had been permanently changed. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. This was how fear spread through California. Not through one enormous event, but through repeated violations of ordinary life. A person could hear about an attack and think, for a moment, that it had happened somewhere else. Then another attack occurred. And another. Eventually, the question changed. It was no longer, could this happen here? It became, when will it happen again? The offender seemed to understand how to exploit that fear. He did not need to attack every night to maintain terror. The possibility was enough. People began changing the way they lived. They checked doors more carefully. They looked at windows before sleeping. They became suspicious of unfamiliar vehicles. They listened for noises outside. A house that had once represented comfort could now become a place where every unexpected sound demanded attention. The investigation grew with the attacks. Detectives began comparing cases and searching for common characteristics. The offender's behavior was becoming recognizable. He appeared to target residential homes. He preferred nighttime. He showed patience. He seemed to prepare. He could control multiple people. He could leave before police arrived. And he appeared to collect knowledge from every successful attack. That last characteristic made the investigation particularly difficult. A criminal who repeatedly escapes learns. Every time he avoids detection, he gains information. Every police response can teach him something about how law enforcement works. Every mistake that investigators make becomes something he can potentially avoid in the future. The East Area rapist appeared to be adapting to his environment. But the investigators were adapting too. Evidence was collected. Statements were taken. Crime scenes were examined. Patterns were documented. And biological material was preserved. At the time, nobody knew how important that material would eventually become. DNA was still a relatively new forensic tool. It could not provide investigators with the magical answer that modern audiences sometimes imagine. An unknown sample could be preserved and compared, but there was no simple database capable of producing the offender's name. Still, the biological evidence was powerful. It could tell investigators that different crimes were connected. The same unknown person was leaving the same genetic signature. That meant that even when the offender crossed jurisdictions, the evidence could follow him. The police might have different files. Different detectives might have different theories. But the biological evidence did not care about county boundaries. It carried the same information wherever it went. Then came the killings. The transition from sexual assault to murder represented a terrifying escalation. The case was no longer simply about a predator who entered homes and attacked people. The possibility now existed that the same man was capable of taking lives. In 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were murdered in Ventura County. Their deaths became an important part of the investigation because biological evidence from the crime could later help connect the murders in Southern California with the earlier attacks in Northern California. The geography was changing. The name of the offender was changing. But the evidence was beginning to reveal continuity. In Southern California, investigators were dealing with a killer who would become known as the original Night Stalker. For years, the crimes could appear to belong to different offenders. One jurisdiction had its East Area rapist. Another had its original Night Stalker. The investigators did not immediately have the complete picture. But the truth was slowly assembling itself. The same man could be responsible for both. The realization was chilling. It meant that the attacks were not isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger campaign. And that campaign had already crossed a significant distance. The offender could move. He could change his surroundings. He could disappear into new communities. But the victims remained connected by the evidence he left behind. Then, after years of violence, the attacks stopped. By 1986, the known series attributed to the offender had come to an end. There was no final confrontation. No dramatic chase through the streets. No detective placing handcuffs on a suspect. The man simply disappeared from the known crime pattern. For the investigators, this was an agonizing ending. A case can be difficult when a suspect is actively committing crimes. At least then there is the possibility that he will make a mistake. When the crimes stop, the trail can become colder. The offender could have moved. He could have changed his behavior. He could have stopped entirely. He could have died. Or he could have been living quietly among ordinary people. For the victims, however, the end of the attacks did not mean the end of their fear. The offender had left. The memory remained. Years could pass without another attack, but the people who had survived could still remember the night when someone entered their home. A sound could bring the memory back. A dark hallway could bring it back. The feeling of being alone could bring it back. The investigation, meanwhile, became a cold case. The files did not disappear. The DNA did not disappear. The photographs did not disappear. The evidence remained stored away, waiting for a future investigator to look at it with new technology. And that was the strange paradox at the heart of the case. The killer believed that leaving the scene meant leaving the danger behind. He could disappear into the darkness. He could return to ordinary life. He could grow older while investigators struggled to identify him. But every crime scene contained a trace of the person who had been there. A biological trace. A memory. A pattern. A piece of information. The offender had spent years trying to remain invisible. But he had never been completely invisible. The evidence had seen him. It simply could not yet tell investigators who they were looking at. For more than 3 decades, that would remain the central mystery. Who was the man behind the attacks? Where had he gone? Was he still alive? Was he still living in California? Had he changed his life completely? Had he watched the investigation from a distance, knowing that police still possessed evidence that could eventually expose him? Nobody knew. Meanwhile, the victims continued living with the consequences of the crimes. The world moved forward. Technology changed. The old photographs faded. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited the case. And the evidence remained. The Golden State Killer had disappeared into time. But time had not erased him. It had only postponed the moment when science would finally catch up with the crime. The night had changed forever for the people he attacked. And decades later, another night would come when investigators finally stood close enough to the truth to give that shadow a name. But that moment had not yet arrived. First, they had to endure years of silence. And in a cold case, silence can be the most difficult enemy of all. When the attacks finally stopped, the investigators were left with something almost as difficult to fight as the offender himself: uncertainty. There was no body to lead them to an identity. No confession. No suspect standing inside an interrogation room. No final confrontation that could explain where the man had gone. There were only scenes. Homes that had been disturbed. Victims whose lives had been changed. Statements recorded by detectives. Photographs taken after the crimes. And biological evidence. At the time, that evidence could not tell investigators the man's name. But it could tell them something almost as important. The person who had committed one crime could be connected to another. That possibility began changing the investigation. For detectives, every crime scene was a silent record of what had happened. They had to examine the smallest details, because the offender had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid being seen. A disturbed object, a trace left behind, a pattern in the way the offender entered or exited a house, or a biological sample could become important. Nothing could simply be dismissed. The investigation required patience. The kind of patience that becomes difficult when the public wants an answer. People wanted to know who was responsible. Families wanted to know whether the person who had destroyed their sense of safety was still nearby. Survivors wanted to know whether the man who had entered their homes could ever be identified. But investigators had to work with what they had. And what they had was incomplete. The early crimes in Visalia had initially appeared to belong to a burglar. Then the attacks in Sacramento revealed a more dangerous offender. Later, murders in Southern California suggested an even darker connection. The names changed as the cases moved from one jurisdiction to another. Visalia ransacker. East Area rapist. Original Night Stalker. Different names seemed to describe different criminals. But evidence was beginning to suggest otherwise. The same unknown offender appeared to be behind the crimes. The realization was important because it meant that evidence from one investigation could help solve another. A biological sample recovered years earlier could be compared with evidence from a later murder. If the samples matched, investigators would know that the same person had been present. This was one of the great strengths of DNA evidence. It did not depend upon memory. It did not depend upon a witness recognizing an older face. It did not care that the crimes had happened in different counties. It did not care that investigators had changed. The genetic signature remained. In an investigation that had become fragmented by geography and time, DNA created a thread. The thread was thin. But it was real. The murders made that thread even more important. When Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed in Ventura County in 1980, investigators collected evidence from the scene. That evidence would later become crucial in connecting the Southern California murders with the earlier attacks attributed to the East Area rapists. The picture slowly became clearer. One man. Different locations. Different years. Different victims. But the same biological evidence. The investigation was no longer simply searching for an unknown killer in one city. It was searching for a predator who had moved through California over many years. Yet knowing that one person was responsible was not the same as knowing who that person was. That was the problem. DNA could establish a connection. It could not provide a name. Imagine holding the answer to a mystery in your hands, but having no way to read it. That was essentially the position investigators found themselves in. They knew the offender had left something behind. They knew that biological evidence could be compared. They knew the evidence could connect crimes. But they could not search it against the kind of enormous genetic databases that would later become available. There was no modern genetic genealogy. There was no way to construct a family tree from an unknown offender's DNA. There was no method for following distant relatives backward through generations. The evidence had to wait for science. And so the case grew colder. By 1986, the known attacks had stopped. The offender vanished from the pattern. For investigators, this created a disturbing possibility. Perhaps he had been arrested for another crime under circumstances unrelated to the attacks. Perhaps he had moved. Perhaps he had stopped because he believed the investigation was becoming too dangerous. Perhaps he had simply changed. Nobody knew. The absence of new crimes made the investigation even more difficult, because every passing year reduced the number of fresh clues. Witness memories faded. People moved away. Neighborhoods changed. Vehicles disappeared. Records became older. Investigators, who had worked the original cases, eventually retired. But the physical evidence remained. That evidence became the bridge between the past and the future. For decades, it sat in police custody while technology advanced around it. The world that had existed when the first attacks occurred slowly disappeared. The cars changed. The streets changed. The technology inside homes changed. People began carrying computers in their pockets. The internet connected investigators and databases across enormous distances. And eventually, ordinary people began submitting their DNA to genealogy services. That development would transform the meaning of the old evidence. But during the years when the case remained unsolved, investigators could only continue searching. The public gradually stopped hearing about the crimes. New stories replaced the old ones. The East Area rapist became a figure from another era. The original Night Stalker became an unsolved mystery. For people who had not lived through the attacks, the case became something they read about rather than something they feared. But the victims knew better. They remembered. They remembered what it meant to wake up and realize that someone had entered their home. They remembered the fear. They remembered the investigation. They remembered the unanswered questions. And the families of those who had been killed remembered the loss. For them, the case was never truly cold. A file could be placed into an archive. A detective could move to another assignment. A newspaper could stop printing stories. But grief does not follow an investigative calendar. Neither does trauma. The evidence therefore carried a responsibility that extended far beyond the courtroom. It represented the possibility that one day the victims would finally know who had done this to them. That possibility was small. At times, it may have seemed almost impossible. But it never completely disappeared. The biological evidence remained. That was the crucial fact. The killer could disappear. The witnesses could grow older. The investigators could retire. But DNA could remain. And because the evidence could survive for decades, the case itself remained capable of being reopened. That is what happened when investigators in later years began looking at the old files with new technology. They did not begin with a blank page. They began with decades of accumulated work. The early investigators had already established patterns. They had already collected evidence. They had already preserved biological material. They had already recognized connections between crimes. The future investigators were able to build on that foundation. This is important because cold case breakthroughs rarely happen because one person suddenly discovers everything. They happen because investigators from different generations leave pieces behind for the people who come after them. One detective notices a pattern. Another preserves a sample. Another compares evidence. Another creates a new database. Another asks a different question. Eventually, those pieces can form a picture. In the Golden State Killer investigation, the most important piece was something the offender had never been able to take away. His biological signature. It had survived him. And as forensic science developed, that signature became more powerful. The question was no longer simply whether investigators knew what DNA was. They did. The question was what they could do with it. Could an unknown genetic profile be connected to a family? Could distant relatives reveal a branch of ancestry? Could investigators work backward through generations? Could they narrow thousands of possibilities into one living person? Those questions would eventually lead investigators toward a technique that had not existed when the first crimes were committed. Forensic genetic genealogy. The concept was both simple and revolutionary. The killer did not need to have voluntarily placed his own DNA into a database. Someone related to him might have. A distant cousin. A relative whose family history stretched back through generations. Someone who had never heard the name East Area Rapist. Someone who had never imagined that a genealogy test taken out of personal curiosity could someday become part of a criminal investigation. This changed the rules. For more than 40 years, investigators had been trying to move from crime scene to suspect. Now they could potentially move from crime scene to family. And from family to identity. The old DNA evidence had not changed. The evidence was still the same. What changed was the question investigators could ask of it. The answer had been waiting inside those samples for decades. And somewhere in California, the man responsible was growing older. Joseph James DeAngelo had not vanished from the world. He had simply disappeared from the investigation. He had lived among ordinary people while the case remained unresolved. The police did not yet know that his identity was about to emerge from a family tree. They did not yet know that the evidence they had preserved for decades would eventually lead them to his doorstep. They only knew that they finally had a new way to look at an old mystery. The cold case was no longer frozen. It was beginning to move. And once the investigation began following the genetic trail, the man who had spent more than 40 years hidden behind aliases would have nowhere left to hide. The evidence had survived the decades. Now it was ready to speak. For more than 40 years, the investigators searching for the Golden State Killer had one enormous problem. They knew what he had done. They knew how he operated. They knew that several crimes separated by hundreds of miles could be connected. And eventually, they knew that the same biological evidence appeared across different cases. But they did not know the one thing they needed most. His name. That missing name turned the investigation into a long series of possibilities, theories, and dead ends. In the beginning, investigators were not even certain that all of the crimes belonged to the same man. The Visalia ransacker cases looked like one investigation. The Sacramento attacks looked like another. The murders in Southern California appeared to belong to yet another offender. Different departments had different evidence. Different investigators were working with different victims and different locations. The offenders' names changed depending on where he struck. For years, the idea that one man could be responsible for everything was difficult to prove. But the behavior kept pointing in the same direction. The offender was careful. He appeared to study his surroundings. He entered homes at night. He understood how to control people inside them. And he repeatedly disappeared before police could catch him. That created an unusual kind of suspect profile. Investigators were not simply looking for someone who was violent. They were looking for someone who could remain organized under pressure. Someone who understood how to move through residential neighborhoods without drawing attention. Someone who could commit a crime, leave, and then return to an ordinary-looking life. That made the suspect pool enormous. California contained millions of men. The offender could be almost anyone. The investigation, therefore, depended on eliminating possibilities. But elimination takes time. And time was exactly what the case had too much of. The DNA evidence helped establish that the same unknown offender was connected to multiple crimes, but it could not immediately produce an identity. As the years passed, the biological evidence became more valuable, yet the identity attached to it remained unknown. Investigators could compare one crime with another. They could say that the biological material came from the same person. They could connect crimes that had once appeared unrelated. But when they asked the most important question, the evidence remained silent. Who is he? That silence created room for theories. Could the offender have been someone with police or military experience? Could he have had knowledge of law enforcement procedures? Could he have been familiar with neighborhoods before attacking? Could he have lived close to some of the crime scenes? Could he have moved frequently? Could he have stopped because he had been arrested for an unrelated offense? Could he have died? Each possibility had to be considered. None could be proven. The most frustrating possibility was that the offender might have been living normally while investigators continued looking for him. A man could go to work. He could shop for groceries. He could drive through California traffic. He could speak to neighbors. He could grow older. And the entire time, somewhere inside police evidence storage, his genetic signature could be waiting. This is what made the case different from many investigations, in which the suspect eventually makes a mistake that immediately reveals his identity. The Golden State Killer seemed to disappear into ordinary life. Years passed. Then decades. The original investigators grew older. Some retired. Others died. New detectives inherited the case. The technology available to those new investigators was radically different from the technology available in the 1970s. But the fundamental problem remained. There was a DNA profile without a name. That was both the strength and weakness of the evidence. The profile could tell investigators that they were dealing with the same offender. It could not tell them where he lived. It could not tell them what job he had. It could not tell them whether he was married. It could not tell them whether he had children. It could not tell them whether he was sitting in a house somewhere in California watching the news. The investigators were therefore forced to wait for something else. A new clue. A new witness. A new database. A new forensic technique. Anything that could transform the unknown genetic profile into a person. And then technology began changing the investigation. The rise of consumer genealogy databases created a possibility that had never existed when the first attacks occurred. Investigators could potentially search for relatives of the unknown offender. Not the offender himself. A relative. That meant the investigation could begin moving backward through a family tree. Instead of asking, "Who is this man?" investigators could ask, "Who could be genetically related to this man?" That was a completely different question. And it opened an entirely different path. The investigators did not immediately discover Joseph James DeAngelo. They discovered family connections, branches, distant relationships, names that, by themselves, meant almost nothing. But the detectives could narrow them. They could examine ages, locations, family structures, places where people had lived. The process was slow and methodical. A possible relative could lead to another relative. That person could lead to another branch. The family tree became a map. Some branches ended. Others continued. And gradually, the enormous number of possibilities began shrinking. Eventually, investigators encountered a name that demanded closer attention. Joseph James DeAngelo. At first, a name was only a possibility. The detectives could not simply point at him and declare that the decades-old crimes had been solved. They needed to determine whether the man fit the evidence. His age fit the general timeline. His history included connections to areas relevant to the investigation. And perhaps most strikingly, he had once been a police officer. That detail changed the atmosphere surrounding the investigation. A former police officer would have understood law enforcement in a way that most suspects could not. He would have known how officers searched neighborhoods. He would have understood procedures. He would have known that evidence could be collected. He would have understood how investigators approached a crime scene. And yet, this did not automatically make him the killer. Investigators still needed proof. This was crucial. A family connection could create suspicion. A suspicious background could create suspicion. A geographic connection could create suspicion. But none of those things could replace DNA. The investigators needed to compare DeAngelo's biological material directly with the evidence preserved from the crimes. So the focus shifted. The man who had been hidden behind a genetic family tree now became the subject of discreet investigation. The investigators watched him. They looked for opportunities to obtain DNA without alerting him. They needed a sample that could answer the question conclusively. Was Joseph James DeAngelo the man whose DNA had haunted the investigation for decades? The stakes were enormous. If the DNA did not match, the investigation could collapse back into uncertainty. The family tree would become another dead end. Another promising path that had led nowhere. Another name added to a long history of unanswered questions. But if it matched, everything would change. The investigators would finally have something they had never possessed before. A direct connection between a living person and the biological evidence from the old crimes. The process required patience. They could not rush. They had spent decades waiting. There was no reason to risk the entire case by acting too quickly. The evidence had survived for 40 years. The investigators needed to make sure the final step was just as solid as everything that came before it. Eventually, biological material associated with DeAngelo was obtained and compared with the DNA from the crime scenes. Then came the result. The DNA matched. The name Joseph James DeAngelo was no longer simply a possibility. It was connected to the evidence. The unknown offender finally had an identity. The man investigators had been searching for under different names had been living in California all along. The East Area Rapist. The original Night Stalker. The Golden State Killer. The three identities were finally connected to one man. But there was something deeply unsettling about the discovery. The investigators had spent decades imagining the offender as someone they might one day encounter. They had built profiles. They had studied his behavior. They had examined the evidence he left behind. And now they discovered that the man had grown old. He was no longer the figure who had haunted California neighborhoods in the 1970s. He was an elderly man. A grandfather. Someone who, from the outside, could appear completely ordinary. That contrast was almost impossible to reconcile. The image created by the crimes was violent and terrifying. The man investigators found was old. Time had changed his face. But it had not changed his DNA. The case had finally reached the point where the evidence and the identity met. Now the investigators had to move carefully toward the final step. An arrest. On April 24, 2018, authorities arrested Joseph James DeAngelo in Citrus Heights. The man who had avoided identification for more than 4 decades was finally in custody. The investigation that had begun with the Visalia ransacker had reached its most important turning point. The aliases were no longer mysteries. The DNA had a name. The family tree had led somewhere. And the cold case that had seemed almost impossible to solve was suddenly alive again. But the arrest did not erase the decades of uncertainty. It did not erase the attacks. It did not erase the murders. It did not return the people who had been lost. It did something different. It finally gave the survivors, families, investigators, and communities an answer to the question that had remained unanswered for more than 40 years. Who was he? Now they knew. Joseph James DeAngelo. And for the first time, the man who had spent decades hiding behind darkness was standing where the law could finally reach him. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had existed in the investigation as a contradiction. The detectives knew his crimes. They knew his patterns. They knew the biological evidence belonged to the same unknown offender. But they had never been able to attach a face to the DNA. Now, that was beginning to change. The breakthrough did not arrive as a dramatic confession, or a sudden witness who remembered the killer's face. It came through something much quieter. A family tree. The idea had seemed almost impossible when the crimes were committed. In the 1970s and 1980s, investigators could collect biological evidence, preserve it, and compare it with evidence from another crime. But they could not take an unknown DNA profile and search through the relatives of millions of people. Decades later, technology had created a new possibility. Investigators could begin with the unknown DNA and search for genetic relatives. Not necessarily a brother. Not necessarily a parent. Not necessarily someone who knew the killer personally. A distant relative could be enough. That possibility transformed the cold case. The investigators were no longer standing in front of a locked door with no key. They were standing in front of a family tree with thousands of branches. Their task was to determine which branch could lead back to the unknown offender. The process required extraordinary patience. A genetic match to a distant relative did not mean that person was the criminal. It meant only that the person shared ancestry with the unknown DNA profile. From there, investigators had to reconstruct relationships. They examined family lines. They considered generations. They looked at locations. They considered ages and timelines. They gradually narrowed the possibilities. The work was almost invisible from the outside. There was no dramatic police chase. No suspect running through an alley. No detective shouting into a telephone. Instead, there were names. Dates. family connections, old records, and the silent mathematics of DNA. The investigators were essentially traveling backward through time. The Golden State Killer had spent decades moving forward, aging like everyone else. The detectives were moving backward, following the biological history hidden inside his genes. Eventually, one branch of the family tree led them toward a name: Joseph James DeAngelo. The name did not immediately end the investigation. It began another stage. DeAngelo had lived in California. His age fit the timeline. His history placed him in areas relevant to the investigation. And there was a detail that made him especially interesting. He had worked as a police officer. For investigators, that fact carried weight. The offender had always appeared unusually familiar with police behavior. He seemed to understand how law enforcement searched for evidence. He seemed comfortable moving through neighborhoods without drawing attention. He had demonstrated an ability to remain ahead of investigators. Now the detectives had identified a man whose professional background gave him knowledge of the very system that had been trying to find him. But suspicion was not enough. A genealogy connection was not enough. A geographic connection was not enough. A professional background was not enough. They needed the one thing that could transform a theory into evidence: DNA. The investigators began watching DeAngelo carefully. They did not want him to know that he was being investigated. If he realized the police were closing in, he could destroy evidence, disappear, or take other measures that could complicate the case. The investigators therefore had to remain patient. They waited for an opportunity to obtain biological material from him. The case had already survived 40 years. A few more days would not matter. Eventually, investigators were able to obtain a sample associated with DeAngelo and compare it with the DNA preserved from the old crime scenes. The comparison produced the result they had been searching for. The DNA matched. The moment was extraordinary because it connected two worlds that had been separated by more than 4 decades. On one side was the evidence from the 1970s and 1980s. Old crime scenes. Old photographs. Old reports. Old memories. On the other side was Joseph James DeAngelo. A living man. An elderly man. A man who had spent decades outside the reach of the investigation. The DNA connected them. Suddenly, the different names attached to the case began to collapse into one identity. The Visalia ransacker was no longer simply an unknown burglar. The East Area rapist was no longer a faceless predator. The original Night Stalker was no longer an unidentified killer. They were connected to Joseph James DeAngelo. And the significance of that discovery went beyond the arrest itself. For decades, investigators had wondered whether the offender had been hiding somewhere nearby. Now they knew. He had not disappeared into another country. He had not become a ghost. He had been living a life. The discovery created a disturbing contrast. The man connected to some of California's most terrifying crimes was no longer the young offender described in decades-old reports. Time had changed him physically. His face had aged. His body had aged. His world had changed. But his genetic identity had remained the same. That was the power of the evidence. DNA did not care how much time had passed. It did not care that investigators had changed. It did not care that the offender had grown older. It did not care that the case had become a historical mystery. The DNA simply remained what it had always been. His. On April 24, 2018, authorities moved. Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in Citrus Heights. The arrest brought the decades-long investigation into a new phase. For the public, it was shocking. For survivors, it was something more complicated. There could be relief. There could be disbelief. There could be anger. There could be memories returning with a force that had been impossible to anticipate. For investigators, there was another feeling. Confirmation. The theory had survived the scrutiny. The biological evidence had spoken. The man they had been searching for was finally in custody. But the arrest itself was not the end. The investigators still had to establish the full scope of what DeAngelo had done. They had to revisit old cases. They had to examine evidence. They had to determine which crimes could be charged. They had to reconstruct decades of violence. The investigation that had once been about finding a name now became an investigation into everything that name represented. And that meant returning to the past. The old crime scenes. The old victims. The old evidence. The old files. The investigators had to open chapters that had been closed for years. Some of those files had been waiting for decades. Now they had a suspect who could potentially connect them. The breakthrough had solved the central mystery. But it also revealed the enormous scale of the story. This was not one crime. It was not one victim. It was not one night. It was a pattern that had stretched across California and across years. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had not simply identified a man. It had reopened history. And for the victims and their families, that history was not abstract. It was personal. The arrest meant that the person responsible could finally be confronted by the legal system. It meant that survivors could hear his name spoken not as a theory, but as the identity of the man accused of attacking them. It meant that families, who had spent decades wondering whether justice would ever come, could finally see the investigation moving toward a courtroom. The technology that made the breakthrough possible would later influence countless other cold case investigations. But in April 2018, investigators were focused on one thing. Joseph James DeAngelo. The man behind the DNA. The man behind the aliases. The man behind the decades of unanswered questions. For more than 40 years, he had benefited from the limitations of technology. Now those limitations were gone. The same evidence that had once been incapable of naming him had become the path that led directly to him. And that transformation is what makes the Golden State Killer investigation so extraordinary. The evidence did not suddenly appear. It had been there all along. The investigators had not suddenly discovered the DNA. They had preserved it decades earlier. What changed was the ability to interpret it. Science had finally caught up with the crime. The killer had spent years depending on anonymity. He had relied on darkness. He had relied on distance. He had relied on time. But time had produced something he could not control. Technology. The world changed around him while the evidence remained. And when the investigators finally connected his DNA to a family tree, then to a name, and finally to a direct genetic match, the 40-year mystery began to collapse. The shadow had become a person. The person had become a suspect. The suspect had become a DNA match. And the DNA match was now in custody. But the most difficult chapter was still ahead. The courtroom would force the case out of the world of shadows, theories, and forensic breakthroughs and into the public record. Victims would have the opportunity to speak. Families would confront the man whose crimes had changed their lives. And Joseph James DeAngelo would finally have to face the consequences of the identity he had hidden for so long. The investigation had found him. Now justice would have to decide what to do with him. When Joseph James DeAngelo entered the courtroom, the man standing before the victims' families was not the young man described in the old police reports. More than 4 decades had passed. The face investigators had once imagined was now the face of an elderly man. His hair was gray. His body had aged. The years that had separated the crimes from the arrest were visible in him. But for the people sitting inside that courtroom, time did not erase the past. For them, the man at the defense table was connected to nights that had never truly ended. He was connected to homes that had once felt safe. He was connected to victims who had survived and to families who had lost people they loved. He was connected to memories that had remained buried for decades. The arrest in 2018 had answered one question. Now the courtroom had to answer another. What would justice look like after 40 years? The case against DeAngelo was enormous. Investigators had spent years going back through old files, comparing evidence, reviewing statements, and identifying crimes that could be connected to him. The investigation had begun with an unknown offender. It had eventually produced a name. Now prosecutors had to transform that name into a criminal case that could survive in court. The evidence was powerful. DNA had linked DeAngelo to crimes committed decades earlier. The genetic genealogy investigation had helped lead authorities to him. But the courtroom was different from the investigation room. A detective could follow a theory. A prosecutor had to prove a case. The victims and their families were no longer watching a cold case from a distance. They were now watching the man accused of creating their suffering sit only a short distance away. And then came the decision that would dramatically change the course of the proceedings. In 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. He also admitted to numerous additional crimes that had not been formally charged, including sexual assaults. The guilty plea meant that many survivors and families would not have to endure a long criminal trial, in which the details of their trauma would be examined repeatedly. There would be no need for prosecutors to reconstruct every crime in front of a jury in order to establish his guilt on the 13 murder charges to which he pleaded. The man they had been searching for had admitted responsibility. After more than 40 years, the question of identity had become a question of accountability. For the victims, however, a guilty plea did not make the past disappear. Instead, it gave them a moment they had waited years to see. They could finally speak. During the sentencing proceedings, survivors and relatives of victims confronted DeAngelo directly. Some had waited more than 40 years for that opportunity. They had lived through the original attacks when they were young. They had carried the memories through marriages, careers, children, moves, and decades of ordinary life. Some had spent years wondering whether the offender would ever be caught. Some had wondered whether he was still alive. Some had wondered whether he had ever thought about them. Now he was sitting in front of them. The courtroom became a place where the survivors could reclaim something that had been taken from them. Their voices were no longer simply evidence in an old police file. They were speaking directly to the man responsible. That moment was especially powerful because DeAngelo had spent decades controlling the circumstances of his crimes. He had entered homes at night. He had chosen the moment. He had controlled the people inside. He had disappeared. In the courtroom, that control was gone. He could not vanish into darkness. He could not choose when the hearing ended. He could not erase the testimony. The survivors controlled the room with their words. For years, the offender had been the center of the mystery. Now the victims were reclaiming the center of the story. They described what the crimes had done to them. They described fear. They described the lasting consequences. They described the years of carrying memories that other people could not fully understand. And they spoke for those who were no longer alive to speak for themselves. The courtroom therefore became more than a place where punishment would be imposed. It became a place of remembrance. Every statement brought another life back into the public record. A person who had been reduced by the passage of time to a name in a case file could once again be described as a human being. A husband. A wife. A family member. A friend. A person with plans and hopes and an ordinary future that had been violently interrupted. For the families of Lyman and Charlene Smith and the other murder victims, the courtroom also represented the end of a long search for accountability. Their loved ones could not be returned. Nothing the court could do could change that. But the person responsible could be named. He could be held. He could be sentenced. And his crimes could be permanently recorded in the legal history of the case. The sentence was severe. DeAngelo received multiple consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. The death penalty was removed as part of the plea agreement. For prosecutors, the agreement ensured that DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life in prison while avoiding the uncertainty and enormous emotional burden of a lengthy capital trial. For survivors, the meaning was more personal. The man who had once been able to disappear after an attack would never again be free to walk through another neighborhood at night. The sentence could not repair the damage. But it could prevent another victim. And perhaps that mattered more than any symbolic punishment. The courtroom also revealed something important about the passage of time. When the crimes occurred, many people believed the investigation might never be solved. The killer had disappeared. The case had gone cold. Decades passed. But the criminal justice system had continued carrying the evidence forward. The old files were not forgotten. The biological evidence was preserved. The victims' statements remained. Eventually, technology created the opportunity to identify the offender. And then the legal system took over. This sequence is important. The breakthrough did not happen because time somehow solved the crime. It happened because people preserved evidence. Investigators kept searching. Scientists developed new methods. And eventually, those efforts converged. The courtroom was the final destination of that long chain. But even after the sentence, there remained an uncomfortable truth. Justice is not the same thing as healing. A sentence cannot give someone back the years they spent afraid. It cannot erase the memory of a stranger entering their bedroom. It cannot undo a murder. It cannot return a husband to his wife, or a wife to her family. It cannot make a survivor forget. What justice can do is establish responsibility. It can say, publicly and permanently, that the crimes happened, that the victims were telling the truth, and that the person responsible was identified and punished. That matters. Especially in a case that lasted more than 40 years. The Golden State Killer had depended on anonymity. For decades, the victims knew the crimes, but did not know the name. The courtroom reversed that imbalance. His name was now attached permanently to the crimes. Joseph James DeAngelo. The man who had once been known only through aliases was now a convicted murderer. The East Area Rapist had a name. The original Night Stalker had a name. The Golden State Killer had a name. And that name was now part of a public legal record. But there was another dimension to the case that could not be ignored. The investigation had demonstrated the extraordinary power of forensic genetic genealogy. A technique originally associated with family history had become an investigative tool capable of helping identify an unknown criminal decades after the crimes. The Golden State Killer case became a landmark example of how old biological evidence could be re-examined through modern technology. The DNA had been collected years earlier. The evidence had not changed. What changed was the ability to connect it to a living person. The courtroom therefore represented two kinds of justice meeting at the same time. Traditional justice, built around evidence, prosecution, plea agreements, and sentencing. And modern forensic science, which had transformed a cold biological sample into a path toward identity. Without the first investigators, there might have been no preserved evidence. Without the preserved evidence, there might have been no genetic breakthrough. Without the breakthrough, there might have been no arrest. And without the arrest, there might never have been a courtroom confrontation. The case was the product of generations of work. But the final chapter belonged to the people who had survived. They had lived with the uncertainty. They had watched the years pass. They had seen other cases solved while theirs remained unresolved. Some had probably wondered whether justice would ever arrive in their lifetime. Then, suddenly, it did. Not in the form they might once have imagined. Not with a dramatic chase. Not with a confession immediately after the crime. Instead, it came through DNA. Through a family tree. Through an elderly man who had been living an apparently ordinary life. And finally, through a courtroom where survivors could look at him and speak. The man who had once controlled the night no longer controlled anything. His freedom was gone. His anonymity was gone. His ability to choose when the story ended was gone. The story now belonged to the victims. And as the courtroom proceedings moved toward their conclusion, one of the longest and most haunting criminal investigations in California history finally reached its legal ending. But legal endings are not always emotional endings. For the survivors, there would still be memories. For the families, there would still be empty spaces. For investigators, there would still be the knowledge of how long the case had remained unsolved. And for the wider world, there would remain one extraordinary lesson. A criminal can hide behind time. He can change his appearance. He can build a family. He can grow old. He can believe that the past has disappeared. But evidence does not age in the same way people do. The DNA preserved from those old crime scenes survived. It waited. And when science finally became capable of following it, the trail led all the way back to Joseph James DeAngelo. 40 years after the first attacks, the man who had once seemed untouchable finally stood before the people whose lives he had changed forever. The courtroom could not undo the past. But it could close one door. The question of who had done it was finally answered. The question of whether he would ever face justice was answered too. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. And after more than 4 decades, the Golden State Killer was no longer a faceless shadow moving through California at night. He was a convicted criminal. And the people who had spent so long waiting for the truth finally had it.